He what? He thinks there are 150,000 North Korean troops. Were there even that many when the war started? Well, where does he think Kim pulled them from? I had to ask. Okay, bye. December 24th, 1950. Since the first days of U.S. involvement in Korea, 8th Army has been commanded by Walton Walker. In that time, he's experienced the highest highs and the lowest lows. He has no intention of leaving the job half-finished either. But fate has other plans. This week, Walton Walker dies. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, U.S. 10th Corps began its mass evacuation of troops from Hungnam, while 8th Army drew up plans for new defensive lines. North Korean units began to reform in the vacuum left behind by the retreating UN forces, and the specter of the Chinese Communist forces crept ever southwards. We saw a bit of a crisis of leadership on the American side last week, but the problems extend well beyond that. There are problems on the battlefield, too, among the ordinary soldiers. I mentioned a British general a couple of weeks ago, Leslie Mansergh, who visited UN Forces Commander Douglas MacArthur at his headquarters in Tokyo. Well, Mansergh has been in Korea, too, doing some friendly espionage. See, he's actually on a secret mission for the British Chiefs of Staff to study the situation in Korea, and he speaks to quite a few men in the field, enlisted and officers, British and American, to get a sense of what's going on. To call his final report damning would be putting it mildly. I doubt whether any British really think that the war in Korea will be brought to a successful conclusion. The reason for this is primarily because of the American lack of determination and their inability, up to the time of my visit, to stand and fight. Mansergh identifies specific problems, and some of what he has to say bears a striking similarity to the Chinese analysis of U.S. capabilities after Ulsson. He says American troops are far too reliant on their motor vehicles and trained almost exclusively for rapid advances and rapid withdrawals. They're not good at holding defensive positions, and they tend to panic and lose cohesion when faced with infiltration assaults. These, though, are problems which contradict the core tenets of British military doctrine. The Brits tend to be cohesive and resilient defensively, but attack more cautiously. They will gladly let the artillery and tanks do the heavy work, but the infantry gets its hands dirty when the job calls for it. Mansergh only really levels these accusations at the U.S. Army regular infantry, and does insist the U.S. artillerymen and the U.S. Marines are made of sterner stuff. He believes that these problems seem to extend all the way back to recruitment, and the fact that many American soldiers joined the Army for the promise of subsidized education, and at no point actually expected to have to go and fight. On top of that, those who were capable and committed soldiers often found themselves pulled from the battlefield and given an office job. A problem that was already familiar from World War II reasserted itself in Korea, the disproportionately low percentage of the nation's best manhood that served the infantry regiments of the United States. Because the American instinct for war favors a technological, managerial approach, far too many of the ablest men are diverted to technical and managerial functions. It isn't just the voice of one man either. Brigadier Basil Coad, British 27th Commonwealth Brigade commander, has also submitted negative reports about the competence of the U.S. infantry, even writing, "I think the British contingent's attitude to the American infantry is largely one of contempt." There is reason for some optimism, though. Now, having retreated back to the line north of Seoul, the Americans will be facing the Communist forces in much more favorable ground, much more open and flatter than the far reaches of northern Korea. American firepower should be easier to bring to bear here, and the Air Force has many more miles of road to catch the Chinese supply trucks in the open. The organization of that defense is still in progress, though, and there's plenty of work to do. 8th Army Commander Walton Walker is getting forces in position throughout the week, and the western flank of his defensive line is more or less set. Early morning the 23rd, he leaves Seoul by jeep and heads north towards Uijeongbu to check in with the British 27th Commonwealth Brigade. About 16 kilometers north of Seoul, his jeep starts to pass two large trucks parked on the southbound lane of the road. At that exact moment, a smaller truck, obscured by the vehicles in front of it, and who doesn't see Walker's Jeep, pulls into the northbound lane to pass the parked traffic. Walker's driver swerves, but it's too late. The Jeep is knocked over, expelling its 4 occupants. Everyone is injured and Walker is unconscious. A vehicle behind them, which is also headed north, quickly takes them on board and rushes them to the clearing station of U.S. 24th Division nearby for emergency care. But it's no good. Walton Walker is pronounced dead on arrival from multiple head injuries. The 8th Army commander and the architect of the Pusan perimeter is no more. It is not really a death befitting his accomplishments. 8th Army was not an enviable command when he arrived in Korea, and much of his work there has been a thankless task. Often the demands placed upon him have been unreasonable, even absurd, as we've seen. Even in death, it is still thankless, as his name is now associated at home with the battles at Unsan and Kunuri and the collapse of 8th Army under the Chinese assault. But the men who served under him at the Pusan perimeter will remember him as the man he was then, not the weary man he was worn down to at the end. Walker's replacement has already been selected, in fact, even before his death. It is none other than Matthew Ridgway, who we saw a bit of last week. In anticipation of casualties and potential replacements needed, Douglas MacArthur already consulted with Army Chief of Staff Lightning Joe Collins, and the pair agreed that if a new 8th Army commander was required, then it would be Ridgway. He was the best the American Army had. He had become, even before he took command in Korea, the standard against which other officers were measured. Was he as good as Ridgway? Was he a younger Ridgway? He was fierce, purposeful, relentless, the perfect man to take command at a bad time in a bad place in a war that had suddenly gone from bad to worse, and to put back together an army that was unraveling. The news of Walker's death is sent to Collins immediately, for whom it is still the evening of the 22nd, time difference. The next day, Matt Ridgway formally accepts the command and travels to the Pentagon to collect his papers. He sets off for Tokyo that evening, where he plans to rendezvous with MacArthur before continuing on to Korea. He should arrive next week. General Frank Milburn, commander of U.S. First Corps, assumes command of 8th Army until then. If ever an American officer was perfectly suited for a particular moment in American military history, it was Matthew Bunker Ridgway when he was summoned to take over the shambles of a dysfunctional 8th Army. He was the flintiest of men, rather humorless, fiercely aggressive, as unsparing of himself as he was of others. One could not think of him except as a soldier, and not a peacetime soldier either. That is high praise. And he sounds exactly like what 8th Army needs right now. We'll see how he does soon enough. Back in Korea itself, there's actually some positive news this week for the UN forces. The 10th Corps evacuation from the port at Hungnam finishes this week. Communist forces do harass the evacuating troops with localized attacks and mortar fire, but nothing in the way of a full-scale assault, so it proceeds smoothly. On the 20th, actually, a reformed KPA, or North Korean, unit is identified by 10th Corps. This is the KPA 1st Division, which takes over the sector directly northeast of the perimeter around Hungnam. They don't really do anything and are content to just watch and wait along with the Chinese, but it is another indication that the North Koreans do have plenty of men and equipment left in the field. And with the time and space the Chinese have bought for them, those men are now starting to return to the front lines in large numbers. Anyway, the probing attacks died down after the 21st-ish, as the last elements of U.S. 7th Division set sail for Pusan. Then it's only elements of the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division still ashore, but no assault comes. Today, the 24th, the last elements of 3rd Division and Corps Commander Ned Almond himself leave Hungnam. In addition to 10th Corps, the fleet has evacuated nearly 100,000 Korean refugees. Most of the equipment, too, has been gotten out. All that's left is about 200 tons of ammunition, 700 tons of explosives, and some fuel stocks, and these are not going to linger in Hungnam for very long, because the very final troops to leave are Army engineers and Navy demolitions teams, who blow the port that day before departing directly from the beaches on landing craft. A final salvo of heavy guns from the American ships ensures there is nothing left in Hungnam for the communist forces. The troops that were evacuated last week have actually already arrived in the south at the start of this week. The 1st Marine Division, the first to depart, has arrived at Pusan and gathered at Masan, and Almond orders that division to be transferred to 8th Army's command. On the 20th, ROK 1st Corps, which has also now arrived in the south, is also assigned to 8th Army and takes over the right flank of the planned defensive lines. The ROK are, of course, the South Koreans. You guys keep writing to me every week saying, why do I keep saying that? And I'll tell you now, it is because every week is someone's first episode. And if I talk about KPA, PLA, KMAG, and ROK without saying who they are, it's a confusing mess and people will not continue to watch the show. So stop commenting. UN forces are getting into position, but time is running short. The Chinese are closing in, and attention now turns to when the next large-scale attack will come. Walker's final estimates before his death suggest that at least 3 Chinese armies are within a day's march. These armies, combined with the reformed KPA units, which have sprung up behind the UN retreat, bring his total estimate to 180,000 troops bearing down on 8th Army. Beyond that, Walker has predicted that Chinese and KPA troops near Pyongyang could move to join any offensive in 4 to 8 days, and troops near Hungnam in 6 to 10. Because of these estimates, many believe that the Chinese plan to begin their next offensive on Christmas Day, hoping for a psychological advantage. They made Thanksgiving a miserable affair for the U.S. troops, so perhaps wrecking Christmas is the logical next step. This line of thinking seems to be backed up by some events on the ground, actually. Towards the end of the week, ROK troops on patrol north of the line have a brief skirmish with Chinese troops and bring back 2 prisoners, who reveal under interrogation that a division of Chinese troops has made it as far as Korangpo, just east of Kaesong. The news that the Chinese have penetrated south of the 38th parallel triggers a wave of hysteria in the Western press, who begin reporting that a force of 100,000 Chinese is massed and ready to attack Seoul in the next 24 hours. Where they got that number from is anyone's guess. Maybe from the same place Douglas MacArthur gets his numbers. Now, I'm not just being snippy. I say that because Douglas MacArthur has now done a complete about-face and believes he faces 700,000 communist troops. MacArthur raised the North Korean army like Lazarus from the tomb. The total organized strength of the North Korean forces, this communique pleaded, must approximate 150,000 men at this time, though why was not clear. In addition, there were reports that North Koreans were being trained in Manchuria, and it is probable that another 50,000 conscripts and recruits were available, even though they are not actually in North Korea at the moment. Both of these figures are pretty far from reality. The North Koreans have not actually pulled a second North Korean army out of their backsides in the past 6 weeks, with 3/4 of Korea occupied for most of that time. But the idea of KPA troops joining the Chinese is a real threat, despite any hyperbole. On the 19th, MacArthur tells Washington he needs a minimum of 4 fresh divisions to guarantee the security of Asia, and more than that if he's going to be able to counterattack. This is just not feasible. The U.S. Army only has 1 division and its entire strategic reserve right now, and Washington is totally unwilling to strip troops from European deployments. In Europe, NATO troops are staring down the Soviets, and peace there is by no means a guarantee, which also means only minimal reinforcements can be expected from other European powers too. Deploying to Korea to fight the Chinese is the complete opposite of their security interests right now. And that is the week. Walton Walker's sudden and tragic death leaves a hole in 8th Army to be filled, but Matt Ridgway is en route to fill it, and all indications are that he has the skills to do so. That said, 8th Army is facing the possibility of a Chinese attack on Christmas Day, with its forces not close to ready for that. There are, once again, feelings of trepidation and uncertainty. The only thing we know for a fact is that when Ridgway arrives, he has his work cut out for him to transform 8th Army back into a force with which to be reckoned. He will have to fend off the Chinese in front of him and rein in MacArthur above him. You know, Back when Ridgway first heard the news of the Chinese intervention, he mused whether, in his own words, it was the beginning of World War III, Armageddon, the last great battle between East and West. Well, we shall see if he can prevent that from becoming a reality, because at the very end of this week, Douglas MacArthur submits a list of targets to Washington, targets in North Korea and China, and asks to be provided with 26 atomic bombs to hit them. Not all that long ago on our World War II channel, we did a special on how to build an atomic bomb. And if you're curious about that, then you should check that out right here. It'll come up soon. It is the Time Ghost Army that supports all of our content, both this and that. So for ever more great content, join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Michael Aschenbrenner is the Army Member of the Week. And these are the newest commissioned officers. Do not forget to subscribe. I'll see you next time.